There's a question almost nobody asks directly because it sounds almost too simple to be worth exploring. What does she actually miss, specifically, once someone who truly loved her is gone? Not the relationship in the abstract, not him or her as a person, the specific concrete things. Because when you actually break it down piece by piece, rather than talking about loss as one big blurry feeling, something genuinely revealing emerges about exactly how a narcissistic woman's internal world reorganizes itself around an absence she didn't expect to feel this precisely. Let's start with something worth establishing clearly. This episode isn't structured around stages or moments this time. It's structured around specific losses, the individual, concrete things that go missing, one at a time, and the very particular way each one gets noticed, denied, and eventually, sometimes, acknowledged. The first thing that goes missing, and one of the earliest to actually surface, the specific experience of being fully believed without having to perform credibility first. This is subtle, and it's easy to miss precisely because it's not about grand trust in some abstract sense. It's about smaller daily moments, telling a story about your day, and having it simply accepted at face value. Mentioning that you're upset about something and not needing to first prove the upset is legitimate before receiving any comfort for it. Someone who loved her fully extended this kind of baseline credibility automatically as a starting assumption, rather than something earned fresh in every conversation. What she discovers, often in new relationships or new friendships afterward, is that this baseline credibility isn't actually standard. Most people reasonably extend belief gradually, based on demonstrated trustworthiness over time, rather than offering it freely from the very beginning the way that one specific person did. The absence of this specific thing produces a strange, persistent, low-grade fatigue in every new relationship. The sense of having to constantly establish, prove, and reprove her own credibility when she used to simply be believed, immediately, without that exhausting preliminary work. The second thing that goes missing, access to someone who could tolerate her worst moments without requiring an apology to her afterward. This one is harder to admit, even privately, because acknowledging it requires acknowledging that there were, in fact, worst moments, genuine unfairness, genuine unkindness, moments where she was difficult in ways that weren't really justified by anything happening around her. What made the original relationship remarkable wasn't that these moments never happened. It's that when they did happen, they got absorbed, processed, and then simply released, without becoming a permanent entry in some ongoing ledger of resentment that got brought up again during the next disagreement. New relationships, understandably, don't offer this same grace automatically. Most people reasonably remember unfairness and factor it into how much trust they extend going forward. The specific absence of a relationship that could simply let genuinely bad moments go, completely without lasting cost, becomes noticeable specifically the first time a new partner or friend brings up something from months earlier that she assumed, based on old habits, would have simply been forgotten by now. The third thing that goes missing, and one of the more concrete, almost physical ones, the specific sensation of not having to explain her own reactions before they could be considered valid. This shows up in small, easily overlooked scenarios, needing to leave a social gathering early because of sudden overwhelm, and instead of simply being supported in that need, now having to construct a reasonable-sounding explanation first because a new partner or friend, understandably, wants context before extending accommodation. The old relationship offered something rarer. Reactions got trusted simply because she was the one having them, without requiring a satisfying rationale attached first. This specific kind of unconditional acceptance of her own emotional experience, without a prerequisite explanation, turns out to have been remarkably rare, and its absence produces a persistent, low-grade sense of having to justify herself constantly in ways she never used to have to. The fourth thing that goes missing, a specific quality of attention that noticed things before she had to ask for them to be noticed. This one tends to surface in almost embarrassingly mundane moments, mentioning, once, in passing, that a particular restaurant is a favorite, and then discovering, months later, in an entirely different context, that this detail was remembered and specifically planned around, without ever being asked to remember it. New relationships, even genuinely good ones, rarely operate at this exact frequency of attentiveness, not because the new people care less, but because this specific level of unprompted noticing is genuinely rare, requiring a kind of sustained, effortful attention that most people, even loving ones, don't naturally sustain at the same intensity across an entire relationship. The absence of it produces a strange kind of loneliness, specifically inside otherwise decent relationships, a sense of having to ask for things she used to simply receive, unprompted, as a matter of course. The fifth thing that goes missing, and perhaps the hardest one to name honestly, access to someone whose mood didn't require active management. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it requires acknowledging something about her own past behavior, that she was, at times, difficult to be around, moody, prone to sudden shifts in temperament that required real emotional labor from whoever was near her at the time. What made the original relationship distinct wasn't that this difficulty disappeared. It's that someone was there who could absorb it steadily, without visibly straining under the weight of it, without needing constant reassurance themselves in order to keep providing that steadiness. New relationships, understandably, don't always offer this same capacity, particularly not immediately, which means her own, more difficult moments now sometimes produce visible strain, visible fatigue, visible limits in whoever's around her, reactions that feel confusingly like evidence that something is wrong with the new relationship, when actually what's missing is simply the rare, specific capacity the previous person happened to have, one that most people, reasonably, don't sustain in the same way. I want to pause here and say something important about what these 5 specific losses add up to, taken together, because I think it clarifies something the earlier framings of this topic sometimes leave vague. What she's actually missing isn't a person, in the sense of missing specific physical presence or specific shared history. She's missing a very particular emotional infrastructure, belief without proof, forgiveness without ledger, acceptance without explanation, attention without request, steadiness without strain, that happen to be embodied by one specific person and that she's discovering, slowly and through repeated disappointment, simply isn't standard equipment in most human relationships, even genuinely good ones. This distinction matters enormously because it explains something confusing that shows up constantly in this kind of story. Why the grief, when it finally does surface, often feels less like missing a specific individual and more like missing a specific quality of experience that individual happened to provide. This is precisely why so many women in this position describe a strange, disorienting inability to fully explain what they're grieving to anyone else. It isn't really him or her specifically, in the way missing someone usually gets described. It's the specific infrastructure of unconditional acceptance that person built and maintained quietly for years, without ever asking for equivalent effort in return. I want to say something honest about why this particular framing, 5 specific things, rather than a single unified feeling, matters practically for anyone recognizing themselves in this story from either side of it. If you're the person reading this and recognizing your own experience as the one who provided all 5 of these things, understanding this breakdown clarifies something important. What you offered wasn't ordinary. It wasn't simply being a good partner in some generic sense. It was a specific, unusually generous set of behaviors that most people, even loving ones, don't naturally sustain simultaneously over years without eventually requiring something comparable in return. Recognizing that what you gave was genuinely rare, not standard, not something anyone should have simply expected as baseline, is itself part of understanding why its absence eventually registers so completely for the person who received it and failed, at the time, to notice how much it was actually worth. And if you're recognizing yourself in the other position, as the one discovering gradually through new relationships that keep falling short of an old, unnamed standard, exactly what these 5 specific absences feel like, understanding them, this concretely offers something useful, a map of exactly what actually needs to be looked for and appreciated the next time something resembling this rare infrastructure appears again. Not vague nostalgia for an old relationship, but a specific, actionable understanding of 5 particular behaviors worth noticing and valuing immediately, rather than only in retrospect once they've already been lost. I want to close this first half by returning to where we started. The question of what, specifically, gets missed. Because the answer, laid out this way, is quieter and more precise than the more dramatic language usually applied to stories like this. It isn't really about lost love in some sweeping, cinematic sense. It's about 5 specific concrete forms of generosity, each one individually small enough to overlook while they're actually happening, that together constituted something genuinely rare, and whose absence, once finally, fully registered, tends to produce a very particular kind of quiet reckoning that we'll walk through in the second half of this conversation. What actually happens once all 5 of these absences have been individually noticed, whether that reckoning ever produces real change, and why the person who originally provided all of it rarely, if ever, gets to see any part of this process unfold. Let's pick up exactly where we left off, with all 5 of these absences now individually noticed, and the question of what actually happens once that noticing has accumulated into something harder to ignore. Here's the first thing worth understanding about this accumulation. It rarely arrives as one clean, unified realization. It arrives piecemeal, the way we described in the first half, one absence noticed here, another there, sometimes months or years apart, each one initially explained away as an isolated incident rather than connected to the others. The actual turning point, when it happens, isn't a single dramatic moment of clarity. It's the point at which these 5 separate absences finally get recognized as a pattern rather than 5 unrelated coincidences. And this recognition, when it happens, tends to arrive through a very specific kind of internal accounting that most people never consciously perform until they're forced into it by enough repeated disappointment. Let's walk through what that accounting actually looks like, because it's more specific and more mechanical than people usually expect. It starts with a private, often reluctant tally. How many new relationships, how many new friendships has it now been that have each individually fallen short of one or more of these 5 things? At first, each shortfall gets attributed to the specific person involved. This particular partner just isn't very attentive. This particular friend just isn't very forgiving. This particular acquaintance just needs more context before extending trust. But at some point, usually after enough individual data points accumulate, a different, more uncomfortable question starts to surface. What if the common denominator across all of these disappointing relationships isn't the specific people at all? What if it's simply that the standard she's measuring everyone against was never actually a normal standard to begin with? This question, once it fully lands, does something that the earlier, more diffuse grief couldn't quite do. It reframes the entire loss. Up until this point, the missing pieces felt like a series of separate disappointments in a series of separate people. Once the pattern gets recognized, the disappointment reorganizes itself around a single, much more specific and much more uncomfortable realization that one person, one relationship, happened to provide an unusually complete, unusually generous emotional architecture, and that architecture was specific to them, not something ambiently available in relationships generally, waiting to be found again with enough searching. Here's where the second requirement for genuine change comes in, and it's the same requirement we've touched on in earlier episodes, applied specifically to this pattern. Whether this reframing gets allowed to include an honest accounting of her own role in losing access to it, rather than settling into a more comfortable, externally focused conclusion. It would be easy at this point to conclude simply, relationships in general aren't as good as that one was, treating the loss as evidence about the world rather than evidence about her own past behavior within that specific relationship. This externally focused conclusion is tempting precisely because it requires nothing further from her. No examination of what she took for granted, no discomfort about her own role in the ending, just a slightly sad, slightly cynical belief that she got unusually lucky once and it's unlikely to happen again. The harder, more useful conclusion requires connecting the dots differently, not that relationship was special and now everything else falls short, but That relationship was special, and I contributed to its ending by treating something rare as though it were standard, unlimited, and permanently available regardless of how it was treated. This second conclusion is significantly more uncomfortable because it requires actual self-implication rather than simply cataloging everyone else's comparative shortcomings. And it's precisely this discomfort, genuinely sitting with her own role in the loss rather than simply mourning the loss itself, that determines whether this entire process produces anything that changes her future relationships or simply becomes a permanent, private source of quiet dissatisfaction that never actually translates into different behavior going forward. I want to talk honestly about what happens in the cases where this harder conclusion does get reached, because it's genuinely different from what people typically imagine when they picture a narcissist learning her lesson. It rarely produces a dramatic personality overhaul. What it tends to produce in the cases where real change occurs is something much narrower and more specific. An active, deliberate effort to notice and name the 5 specific things when they appear in new relationships, rather than passively absorbing them the way she once did without registering their value. This might look like actually thanking a new partner explicitly for extending trust without requiring proof first, rather than simply accepting that trust as background noise. It might look like noticing out loud when someone remembers a small detail unprompted rather than letting that attentiveness pass by, unacknowledged the way it once did. These are small, almost unremarkable behavioral shifts, but they represent something genuinely significant. The conversion of a private, painful realization into an active practice of no longer taking the same specific things for granted a second time. I want to be honest, though, about how rare this full conversion actually is, because I don't want to leave this episode sounding more optimistic than the reality typically supports. Far more common is a partial version of this process. The pattern gets recognized, the discomfort gets felt, but the harder, self-implicating conclusion never quite gets reached, or gets reached only briefly before being reburied under a more comfortable, externally focused explanation. In these more common cases, the woman in question ends up with a persistent, low-grade sense that something is missing from her adult relationships without ever fully connecting that absence to her own past behavior, which means the same pattern of underappreciating the exact 5 things we discussed today tends to repeat quietly in whatever relationship comes next. I want to say something important as we bring this entire 2-part conversation to a close, because it's the piece that matters most for anyone who recognizes themselves as the person who originally provided all 5 of these things, and then lost access to someone who never fully appreciated them at the time. This entire process, whether it completes fully or gets stuck partway through, happens on a timeline that has nothing to do with you, in a place you will never be invited to observe, and its outcome, whatever it turns out to be, was never something you needed in order for what you gave to have been real. The belief you extended without requiring proof, the forgiveness you offered without keeping score, the attention you paid without being asked to pay it, none of it becomes less true, less generous, or less worth having given, regardless of whether she ever fully reaches the harder, more uncomfortable conclusion about her own role in losing it. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a well-stocked pantry built over years by someone who filled it carefully, deliberately, with exactly the right ingredients for exactly the meals the person living there actually loved. Nothing generic, nothing assumed, every shelf arranged around specific remembered preferences, restocked quietly before anything ever ran out completely. For years, the person living there simply opened the pantry whenever hungry, took whatever was needed, and never once had to think about where any of it came from, or how much deliberate attention went into making sure it was always exactly what they wanted, always exactly there when they reached for it. And then, one day, that pantry is gone, not through any single dramatic event, but through a gradual withdrawal of the person who filled it, tired of restocking shelves that were never once acknowledged as anything other than simply, automatically, always there. And what follows, for the person left standing in front of an empty kitchen, isn't a single, immediate crisis. It's a slower, more specific unraveling, reaching for a particular ingredient during a particular meal and finding it missing, then another, each absence small enough on its own to explain away, until eventually the pattern becomes undeniable. This wasn't a series of small, unrelated shortages. It was the complete withdrawal of an entire carefully maintained system, one that took years to build, and that nobody else in any subsequent kitchen seems quite willing or quite able to replicate in exactly the same way. Here's what matters most about the person who originally filled that pantry, having long since moved on to tend their own life, their own kitchen, their own careful attention now directed wherever it's actually being received and appreciated. They don't need to witness the empty shelves being discovered one by one in order to know that what they built was real, was valuable, and was worth every quiet hour that went into maintaining it. The pantry was never empty because it was poorly made. It was empty because someone stopped filling it and walked instead toward a kitchen of their own, one where, finally, someone notices exactly how full the shelves are and says so before they're ever given any reason to stop.